Hello, everyone. Welcome. We can see that there's still some folks logging in, but I'm just going to get us started in the interest of staying on time. Thank you very much for joining us here today. My name is Haley Ross, for those of you who don't know me, and I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, or CMI for short. And I'm joined here by Kendall Benesh with the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP for short. And we would like to let you know that KCP and CMI have joined forces again. And we're here to present the 9th season of CMI's Cred Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 11th Winter Webinar Series. Now, before we get going, we would like to acknowledge that the region in which both of our organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Shakwapam, the Tanaha, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. And what I want to do is invite you and give you the opportunity to provide your own land acknowledgement. So if you would like to do that, please go ahead and open up your chat and let us know whose territory you're zooming in from today. And while we do that, I'll just tell you a little bit about the series. So this season of webinars will explore the theme of stewarding for biodiversity. We're welcoming 4 speakers who will discuss the theme from different perspectives, emphasizing that conserving biological diversity for all living things requires a variety of people, viewpoints, and practices. This year's series is financially supported by Ecoscape Environmental and LGL Limited and KCP's program funders, and we send our thanks to all of those organizations. And to kick things off today, we welcome Hilary Page and Richard Klafki with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, who will share their unique journeys of grassland ecology and conservation and how they're collaborating with partners to protect and restore these vital habitats, ensuring a future for healthy bunchgrass ecosystems and the wildlife that they sustain. And I'll be introducing Hilary and Richard in more detail in just a moment. But before I do that, and while those acknowledgements roll in, thanks for participating in that. I'm going to take a moment to introduce CMI and who we are. So the Columbia Mountains Institute, or CMI, is a nonprofit organization working in the various fields of ecology. And primarily what we do is provide professional development opportunities, and those come in the form of conferences, courses, webinars, of course, and they address everything from field and data science research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website, of course, is a good place to learn more about CMI, and it contains really great resources such as proceeding documents, talk recordings from all of our major events, and more. So you can find that at cmiae.org. Now, what I'd like to do is pass it over to Kendall with KCP.
Thank you, Haley. My name's Kendall Benesh, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP. And we're a broad partnership of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, First Nations, other government agencies, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays. And the purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve the biological diversity and naturally functioning ecosystems of the region through land conservation and stewardship, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, which includes sharing technical knowledge and expertise through webinars like this. We're very excited to be co-hosting this webinar series again with Haley and CMI, and we'd like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we'd not be able to support this type of work. And I'll go over just a couple of housekeeping details and then we'll get started. So this webinar is being recorded and we'll post it within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. And we'll have our Q&A at the end of Richard and Hilary's presentation. So please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar and not the chat to add a question into that queue, and we'll do our best to make our way through them at the end of the webinar. And if your question is specific to either Hilary or Richard, please also indicate that in your question. And I'll pass it back to you, Haley.
Great, thanks very much. All right, so now I have the honor to introduce Hilary Page. sorry, Hillary and Paige, Hillary and Richard. And I'm going to read some bios and then we'll get started. So Hillary Page has been with the Nature Conservancy Canada for 16 years and is currently serves as the Senior Director for Conservation in BC. In her current role, Hillary oversees planning, landscape securement, and stewardship in the region. Hillary's conservation journey was sparked as a summer student at the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, where she worked on monitoring open forest restoration projects for the Rocky Mountain Trench. Armed with an undergraduate degree in conservation biology and a master's in wildlife and range management from the University of Alberta, Hillary developed her skills working as an independent biologist in the Columbia Valley, focusing on monitoring effectiveness of open forest and grassland restoration. At NCC, Hillary's mission is clear. She leverages local expertise and scientific knowledge to establish a network of conservation lands that safeguard wildlife habitats, including grasslands, ecological processes, while fostering community engagement. Next, I'm going to introduce Richard. Richard Klafki became interested in pursuing a career in wildlife biology and conservation growing up in the East Kootenay, and has lived and worked as a biologist in the Kootenay region ever since. Richard obtained his BSc in Biology Wildlife at the University of Northern BC, and then completed his MSc in Environmental Science from Thompson Rivers University on road ecology and highway mitigation for badgers in the South Central BC region. Working as a contract biologist, wildlife biologist on a variety of wildlife-related projects over a decade through Western Canada and Ontario, including some short stints in Western United States, led to an understanding that conservation of important habitats is what the species he was passionate about needed most. In 2014, Richard joined the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and now he works as the program director for the Canadian Rockies program based in Invermere, BC. Richard is responsible for directing and managing conservation projects as defined by science-based planning frameworks, building strong relationships, and coordinating stewardship priorities within the expansive Canadian Rockies ecoregion. So we're really fortunate to have these two with us today. Hillary, you can take over the screen share now if you like.
Okay. We'll do that.
Thanks.
How does that look?
Looks great. You just have to go into your full screen. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a huge honor to be here today and to host the first CRED Talk of 2025. This is the first webinar I've hosted, and I'm not sure it's Richard's first time. And as I can see the land acknowledgements coming in and a lot of familiar names, which is, I'm feeling a little bit of pressure now because there are a lot of people that have been part of this story. I want to thank Haley and the CMI and the KCP for having us here. And Richard and I would both like to acknowledge that the land we're presenting from and the grasslands we're talking about have been carefully stewarded by Indigenous people since time immemorial. I'll start with a little bit about NCC, the Nature Conservancy of Canada. NCC is a national scale nonprofit that believes with nature, we build a thriving world. Since 1962, NCC has worked in partnership with local communities, First Nations, provincial governments, federal governments, territorial governments, and other conservation groups to take direct action to conserve 15 million hectares from coast to coast to coast. In BC, we've worked to acquire and steward about 95,000 hectares of fee simple land. A lot of that land is stewarded in the Canadian Rockies. Some examples include Columbia Lake, Lot 48, south of Fairmont, or the Darkwoods Conservation Area close to Nelson. We've also worked in partnership with other conservation groups, governments, and First Nations to terminate or acquire privately held rights in public land to endurable conservation outcomes on about 598,000 hectares of public land. Examples of this type of work include the Flathead Watershed Conservation Act and the Nkamapoo Conservancy just south of Revelstoke. A primary focus of NCC's work across the country and here in BC is grassland conservation and stewardship. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the journey that Richard and I have taken to arrive here to work in partnership with organizations like the KCP to conserve these beautiful and incredibly valuable spaces. So you heard a bit about it in our bios. Both Richard and I completed undergraduates in biology. And in the late 1990s, a long time ago, we were both fortunate enough to be hired on as summer students in the same year at the compensation program. And at that time, the compensation program was supporting the first ever badger project in Canada, which was run by Nancy Newhouse and Trevor Kinley of Sylvan Consulting. And the program, as Haley mentioned, was also supporting open forest and grassland restoration and monitoring the effectiveness of that work. So from here, we were able to develop some skills, including how to get trucks out of the mud. There you can see Richard stuck in the mud with his truck. We are able to develop those skills, build some relationships. And as you heard, Richard went on to do a master's in badgers, and I went on to do a master's in grassland and open forest restoration monitoring. We worked as consultants, myself as a plant ecologist, Richard as a wildlife biologist, and fast forward decades later, and Nancy, Richard, and I are all back working together at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and really have the privilege of working to use our skills and passions to conserve grasslands and badgers as a team again. I want to start at the very beginning with grasslands, and I just acknowledge that my start was in grassland ecology. It's been a long time since I've done a Dobbenmeyer plot. I did thousands of them through the trench and other places in BC, but I now really work more in the field of habitat conservation. But I just wanted to start with basic grasslands, what they are, and they're essentially just areas where grass is the dominant vegetation. They occur all around the world. They cover quite a bit of the globe, every place except Antarctica. And North America's biggest biome is actually grasslands. At NCC and across the country, I think sometimes when we say the word grasslands, our mind immediately goes to the vast expanses of prairie grasslands that evolved post-glaciation under grazing pressure of herbivores like bison and pronghorn antelope. And those grazing patterns and fire ecology and indigenous burning and climate shaped the vegetation and soil dynamics to create these highly productive grasslands with those thick black soils that we're used to seeing in Alberta. Grasslands in BC are a little bit different. Primary difference is we don't quite get the coverage that we get in the prairie provinces. BC has less than 1% cover of grasslands. And obviously grassland cover is restricted largely because of geography and climate. And they're located largely in valley bottoms or up in the open plateaus of the central interior. They're also not usually as productive as the grasslands and the prairies. The other primary difference is disturbance. As I mentioned, the grasslands and the prairies have evolved under significant grazing disturbance and fire. And in BC, the primary disturbance has been fire, either lightning caused or indigenous burning. And it's really low intensity, frequent fire that shapes the grasslands along with climate and topography. So despite the restricted cover of grasslands, we don't have that much cover of them, but we have an incredible diversity of grasslands. And here where I'm based in the East Kootenay Trench, we have the semi-arid grasslands, which extend from just north of Invermere down to the US border. And these open grasslands and open forest or tree grasslands have historically been maintained by low intensity, frequent fire. They're characterized generally by blue-butt sweetgrass, rough fescue, needle and threadgrass. And if you're lucky enough to be in the Kimberley and Cranbrook area in the spring, big fields of arrowleaf balsam root. Moving west, things get a little drier, a little more open, less treed. We move into the Okanagan Valley grasslands, which are really an extension of the Columbia Plateau on the south side of the border. As mentioned, these grasslands are a little drier. They're characterized by sagebrush and blue bunch wheatgrass. and also have historically been maintained by fire and climate. Moving north up into around Kamloops and the Thompson Pavilion area, we have the grasslands that have developed really based on the topography of the South and North Thompson rivers. And here we can really see the impact of that topography on grassland development, with a gradual transition of very hot and dry grasslands on the lower grasslands dominated by sage and blue bunch wheatgrass, and then moving up into the upper benches to the relatively cooler, a little bit moist, where if you're lucky, you can find healthy stands of rough fescue. And then moving even a little bit north, we get to the Caribou-Chilcotin, where there are grasslands lying along the Fraser River Basin from Big Bar Provincial Park, north to the Churn Creek Protected Area and just west of Williams Lake. And these grasslands of the Caribou-Chilcotin have sustained numerous historic large ranches like the Gang Ranch that have raised livestock in these areas since the mid-1800s. And we even get grasslands on Vancouver Island that have evolved really under a Mediterranean climate. These Gary Oak communities, savanna, don't cover a huge amount of ground. It's about 2,400 hectares on the island, maintained by a long history of Indigenous burning. And despite their coverage, they're actually highly fragmented too. So most of the sites, the vast majority of the sites occupy less than 2 hectares, making these Gary Oak savannas one of the most imperiled plant communities in Canada. There are also grasslands in the Peace and Boreal areas, and also some great examples of high elevation grasslands, especially in the Elk Valley. But these were the only 2 areas where NCC doesn't actually have a conservation property that supports grasslands in these geographies, so I didn't have photos to share of them, but maybe one day in the future we'll have some conservation areas there we can talk about. So given that there's less than 1% cover of these systems across the province, why do we care about grasslands? Why are we here talking about them? Why do organizations like NCC invest a lot in grasslands? From a biodiversity perspective, and if we're talking about stewarding for biodiversity, grasslands support more endangered species than any other habitat in the province. They support about 30% of our species at risk. Some examples include bighorn sheep, burrowing owl, rubber boa, and of course, American badger. Also, leafy grasslands and grassland habitats are important to people. In a province dominated by public land, about 94% public land, and a lot of rock and ice, the valley bottoms have a disproportionate amount of private land. And this is because this is where people want to live and work. So valley bottoms support Indigenous communities, ranching communities, and rural and urban centers. And for this reason, their continued existence and health is essential. Grasslands are at risk. I think we all know this. This is some mapping done by the Grassland Conservation Council, GCC, mapping grassland loss from 1995 to 2014. Some of the risks to grassland include invasive species. So non-native plants such as knapweed and cheatgrass can outcompete native grasses in the right conditions or wrong, the unhealthy conditions. Agriculture is a threat to grasslands. And when I talk about agriculture here, I mean really incompatible agriculture that's not compatible with healthy grasslands. So conversion to vineyards or tame grass pastures is incompatible with native grasslands. There are many examples of grasslands coexisting with healthy grasslands coexisting with grazing and ranching operations across the province. Obviously, urban development is a threat to grasslands, but we see this differently in different parts of the province. Based on this mapping, it was determined that Central Okanagan lost 8% of their grasslands. The North Okanagan lost 6% of their grasslands, and the Okanagan-Similkameen lost just over 4%. So most other districts experience losses much smaller than that. So the threat of development is really different based on where you are in the province. The other threat to grasslands is forest, oddly enough. Fire suppression and forest ingrowth are a significant cause of grassland loss in BC. So dug out the old blueprint for action from 2016 that the Rocky Mountain Trench Ecosystem Restoration Steering Committee developed. And they did some air photo comparisons. And so here, this is an air photo on the left from 1954, and on the right, 1994. And you can physically see the loss of grassland to forest. And this is largely due to fire suppression. And the impact this has is not only do you see a change in overstory structure, but the loss of light reaching the understory floor has a significant impact on the understory plant community composition. So bunch grasses that dominate native grasslands in BC, they are shade intolerant. And so when you shade out the overstory, you lose these species from the system, and what's replaced are shade tolerant species like in the trenches like pine grass, which don't have the same forage values as native bunch grasses. In that document as well, they actually grouped some air photo comparisons, and over a couple sites, they mapped the loss of open grassland and treed grassland, and the increase in open forest and closed forest. And so you can see over a 50% loss of open grassland in roughly a 40-year period. The issue with this is not only loss of understory structure and bunch grasses, but there's also a significant increase in catastrophic forest fire, which we've seen in the last couple of years during our fire seasons in BC. So what can we do as a collective of partners, organizations, and individuals? Obviously, I'm a little bit biased because I represent NCC, but avoided conversion is the #1 thing we could do to protect healthy grasslands. So conservation land acquisition is, I think, the #1 thing we can do to mitigate on fee simple and public land. So NCC has secured over 11,000 hectares of grassland habitat in BC, along with the partners like the Nature Trust of BC, the Kootenay Conservation Program, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and others. In some biogeoclimatic zones where grasslands are the dominant habitat type, and where there's a disproportionate amount of fee simple land, private land conservation has, in some places, almost effectively doubled the amount of public conservation land and protection. So acquisition and conservation of land by land trusts and other partners is a very important activity, along with publicly protected areas. A recent example of this in action would be the acquisition of Bunchgrass Hills in the Nicola Valley in 2024. So NCC, with the support of Environment Canada, the province of BC, US Fish and Wildlife, and many private donors, were able to secure over 6,000 hectares of high quality grasslands in the Nicola Valley. And this property, I mean, everything I've talked about now, it supports map critical habitat for 4 federally listed species, including badger and Lewis's woodpecker, and also supports important breeding grounds for sharp-tailed grouse. The property had been maintained as a ranch up to the point where NCC was able to acquire it for conservation, and is actually being leased back for grazing at this time. So there's conservation land, public and private, but once the land is in conservation, there's also many stewardship activities we can take to restore, enhance some of the grassland values that are there. Some common activities that NCC does on our conservation lands includes treating of invasives, fencing to promote grassland health, and thinning of trees to restore that open forest structure I was talking about earlier. This is a significant activity for us, significant in terms of cost, and also significant in terms of return, the impact it has on the plant community. Because once we open up the overstory, almost immediately you can see some of these bunch grasses come back. It is a cost-intensive activity, but it has amazing impact. And also the other co-benefit is it is very effective at mitigating catastrophic fire risk. The other benefit of these activities is a direct benefit to species like badgers. And I think the work that Richard has done in the past and the work that NCC does really shows how work at a habitat scale can benefit a single species, and work on a single species can benefit habitat. So I'm going to turn it over to the badger expert to talk about how those two things can work together to have co-benefits for each other.
Thanks, Hillary. I'm just going to share my screen. I believe that's good. Great. Well, thanks, everyone. Yeah, it is an honor to be here and be part of the CMI and the KCP winter webinar. I'm just going to touch on the work that we've been doing through NCC and my previous work with the American badger. I often say the North American badger because it's not just an American species. But here's what a typical badger looks like above its burrow. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background on the species. The Latin name is Taxidia taxus, which of all things, it's to appear or to look like a badger is what it means. And that's probably a nod to the European badger, where Westerners would have came up with the Latin name, and they're completely different species. They eat earthworms. Our guys eat rodents. They're a burrowing mammal or a fossorial mammal, so they have adaptations such as those stiff guard hairs in the ear to keep the dirt out of their ears, and they have a nictitating membrane, if I said that right, over the eye to help protect the eye from dirt. They burrow both for foraging and for security, to den in as well to have their babies, or kits is what they're referred to. They're one of the largest members of the weasel family. And in the middle there, you can see they're quite adaptable to burrowing, not just in native grasslands, but they're happy to burrow under a rancher shed or outbuilding as well. That particular one had a natal den under that shed. So as you can see, the range of badgers in British Columbia, they are considered an endangered species by CSIC, basically the subspecies Taxidia taxus jeffersoni, west of the Continental Divide. Their range in BC basically overlaps the southern half of all the grasslands in our province. They don't do very well up in the north, where it's probably due to the long, cold, frozen winters and soils up there. Yeah, so I was able to do my work on my master's north of Kamloops, up around 100 Mile House, and then I've also worked on the East Kootenay badger study. And I give a shout out that also that Thompson, Rich Weir, and Karina Hudakoff did a research study in the Thompson area, and my work was predicated by Roger Packham working for the ministry up in the 100 Mile House, where he started noticing badgers in the central area, and hence my work was able to start there. This is a picture of west of the highway up west of 100 Mile House. So when you think of badgers and we talk about grasslands, they're quite adaptable. This is a very rocky site. That's old stumps and soil disturbed from a road building process in a lodgepole pine stand on the plateau up there. And underneath those stumps and behind those soil burrows or soil mounds are burrow from an American badger. So they need two primary things. They need somewhere to burrow and they need something to eat. And depending on the habitat of the grasslands, many of the grasslands have things like colonial fossorial rodents like Columbia ground squirrels and yellow-bellied marmots. And other parts in the drier grasslands, they don't have those species, but badgers, they'll dig up voles, and that's a hump-winged cricket that we noticed that they were really targeting in the Lac La Hache area. And also muskrats, ground nesting birds like grouse. So in areas where there's not necessarily a bunch of ground squirrels and marmots, they will find a way if they can find something to eat. So like I said, here's a female coming back to the den with a couple poor juvenile ground squirrels that she's going to feed to her babies. These habitats, they really are helping drive the biodiversity in small mammals and rodents. And so it's really important to have good, healthy plant communities, whether it's a large working ranch or native grasslands. If there's a good biodiversity area with lots of rodents and good places to burrow, they can hold on. A couple of the primary threats is we keep large ranching it's slowly getting whittled away into smaller lots. People can't continue owning large tracts of land. So they put them up for sale, and we slowly have that incremental development just increasing. And in areas where that happens, we documented that, you know, these large areas are really important for females to have their babies, their kids, you know, far away from highways. The roadways are a major source for the mortality of badgers in British Columbia. So the best habitats were these large working ranches out in the far away from highways, where a female badger could year after year have 2 or 3 kids. And so I noticed that in areas that were slowly getting chipped away and developed, that these badgers just kept getting displaced, and they get further and further apart from each other, their core ranges, and they start traveling more. And when they start traveling more in the summertime, that's their breeding season. It results in a lot of this, and that's unfortunate. So that's the other primary need to address the reduction in roadkill, and acquiring lands that even have highways bisecting conservation areas is really important, because there's many ministry initiatives across the province looking at making roads more permeable for wildlife. This was a highway construction upgrade south of 100 Mile House, and this culvert was purposely installed to benefit badger. The idea being that the grass on the right side of the fence line will grow in thick, and the badger will just automatically kind of get redirected along the fence line where livestock would walk and encounter this dry culvert. And we documented that badgers use dry culverts quite a bit. They really do use them a fair bit. They like the smaller ones. One thing that the ministry found that would help save money is they don't need to make large underpasses for their things, species like badgers. Just even a 60-centimeter culvert is sufficient for increasing the permeability of badgers. And in areas where there was a higher density of dry culverts, had a lower intensity of badger roadkill. So, you know, the evidence supports that having more of these on the landscape will help not just badgers, but a variety of species. Up in the central part of the province, I documented, I think, 26 different species, from snakes to ground squirrels to weasels. The larger, you know, the livestock underpasses have black bears and coyotes and mule deer using them. So there's a lot of promise for increasing permeability of highways and connecting large conservation areas that have good quality habitat for badger females to raise their young. A good example of that, so I started with the Nature Conservancy of Canada in 2014, but prior to my starting with the NCC back in 2012, there's an area called Columbia Lake Lot 48. So it's District Lot 48. It's south of Fairmont Hot Springs. It was the last parcel of private land on the east side of Columbia Lake that was poised for development. And it was an important area. It's culturally significant to the local First Nations for both a travel corridor route. More recent historic times, also the salmon fishery was really important before the dams on the Columbia River. And so, like, local First Nations like the Kiskinak First Nation and other regional governments, municipalities, industry partners all came together and fundraised to help NCC acquire the parcel back in 2011, and with I think full ownership in 2012. And so when I came on in 2014, we started working on the open forest restoration. So the areas just in the background here with the larger Douglas fir has the natural high biodiversity grasslands. I believe CMI had a native plant course, and one of the field sites was there, and they noted that that had a high diversity of native grassland type plants. And in the foreground here, in more historic times, Captain Armstrong had a potato patch back at the turn of the century, and then it got converted to hay fields. And so in these hayfield areas, there was, when we acquired the property, I was told that there was hardly a Columbia ground squirrel in the old hayfields. They had people come in and shoot them and reduce them. And in the time since I've been there and continuing working on the open forest restoration, we started noticing, this is a trail camera a few years ago, that the badgers had moved in and started taking care of the Columbia ground squirrel. So it's nice to see that, you know, this place was poised for development, and now combined with the Columbia Lake East Side Management Area, the Columbia River Wetland Wildlife Management Area. Nature Trust has some properties to the south, ecological reserves, that it's now part of a 7,600 hectare, basically conserved area on the east side of Columbia Lake. And we're looking at working on restoring fire in a good way with other partners. More to come on that, I'm sure, from in the coming years. Hopefully it's challenging to reintroduce fire, but we're hoping to be able to do that in the coming years. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of tie that onto the tail end and not take a lot of time. And I thank you for our talk today, and hopefully that didn't run too long. And thank you. I think Haley's going to lead into the Q&A.
You're right. Thank you very much for that, Hillary and Richard. We've got lots of time for questions. So here's what we're going to do, everyone. We're going to be using the Q&A function, as Kendall mentioned at the very beginning. You'll find that on that control panel at the bottom of your screen, there's like a black ribbon with a bunch of icons there. And one of them has a question mark on it, and underneath it says Q&A. Open up that box, and please feel welcome to add your questions on that Q&A, in that Q&A. And what we're going to do is we're also encouraging you to vote for the questions that you would like to hear asked. So if I have my Q&A box open, I can see below the questions that there's a little thumbs up icon. If you click on that icon, if you would like to hear the answer to that question, it'll let us know what the most popular questions are, and then I'll ask them in that order. So that'll be our method, and we've got plenty of time. So first question, likely for Richard, comes from an anonymous attendee. Do you have a picture of badger tracks in the snow, especially fresh snow? Are the tracks inside a half pipe like tunnel? Thanks. So I imagine you don't have time to pull up a picture, but I bet you can answer the question.
Yes, I have a variety of photos of fresh badger tracks and the little plow through the snow and the fresh dirt on top of the snow, not just under in like a half pipe culvert. I'm assuming that maybe where they're talking about the tracks. But even just recently in the last month, I've noted in the Columbia Valley from near Briscoe all the way down to Jaffrey, fresh piles of dirt on the snow. So there's a variety of badgers out right now coming in. They go into torpor, they sleep for a little while, they'll come out like grizzly bears don't go into true hibernation. And these guys will come out and it's like, I'm going to dig up some ground squirrels today in the middle of winter. And so that's a common occurrence, the winter activity.
Great, thank you. Another question from the same person, I believe. And it says, I work as an environmental monitor in the Elk Valley during the summer, and I'm lucky enough to do high elevation grasslands. I'm lucky enough that high elevation grasslands and North American badger are part of my work. I'm curious if NCC is working on acquiring conservation areas in the Elk Valley. Also, do you have any knowledge on the success of badgers inhabiting the areas that have been reclaimed from coal mining there? What are some of your concerns for grasslands and badger populations in this area?
Hillary, do you want, or I can start on the badger one.
Sure, go for it.
So yeah, badgers do use high elevation grasslands all throughout their range, I believe. I found badger burrows up in the Purcell, on the edge of the Purcell Wilderness Conservancy that had been foraging probably for high elevation Columbia ground squirrel colonies. I've had brief conversations with previous tech biologists about badger habitat and ecology, and I know badgers definitely use around the fringe of the mines. There are badgers up and down the farmlands of the Elk Valley. So yeah, we're always looking for good conservation opportunities. And we sit on the KCP Securement Committee with other conservation landholders like the Compensation Program, the province, the Nature Trust of BC. And a lot of the landscapes do get looked at about where priorities could emerge for conservation. So we're always looking for new opportunities if the timing and the conditions and the funding are right.
And I think I just add to that those high elevation grasslands, and I think that's an area where NGOs like the Nature Trust of BC and NCC can make a difference is on fee simple land. A lot of those high elevation grasslands are public land, which doesn't necessarily mean we don't have a role, but it might be a different activity than land acquisition.
All right, I can move on to the next question. Thanks both. We have a question here from Gina, and she says, I'm often doing environmental assessments and critical habitat for badger and CDC badger polygons. How can I be more confident in identifying badger habitat if they're as adaptable as you say?
Pretty much all the southern interior British Columbia, that's not rock, could be potentially, badger could trundle through there. They go over mountain passes. They use old logging roads through Douglas fir forests to connect more open farmlands and ranches. Just keep an eye open for burrows and that activity, and I think that's probably the best thing you can do. And they're really hard to find burrows in areas that doesn't have a lot of colonial rodents, because they'll reuse the same burrow over and over again. And you just got to develop that search image and yeah, do a lot of walking.
Great, thanks. Here's a good question, and it says, can you speak to impacts of grassland wild, sorry, it just disappeared for some reason, my apologies. Okay, can you speak to impacts of grassland wildfire on badger populations? Do the populations tend to move out, or are there benefits, or are there impacts known? Question from Eleanor, I believe.
So the wildfire, hopefully not severe wildfire, is totally beneficial to badgers, because you got to think it just needs to be beneficial to Columbia ground squirrels, mice, voles, marmots, yellow-bellied marmots, or hoary marmots in the subalpine. We noted that in the Rocky Mountain Trench there was a wildfire east. I can't remember what valley it was where there was the white. But one of the resident male badgers that would trundle up and down the Columbia River Valley one year took a big detour up into a wildfire east of Invermere. And if it wasn't for having that animal radio tag, you would never know that. They seem to find these ways to find areas where there's wildfire, old logging landings that have Columbia ground squirrels inhabiting them, and they'll find them. And yeah, whether it's prescribed fire or low intensity wildfire, it's totally beneficial to those rodent colonies and populations, and so it's beneficial to badger.
Okay, great. Okay, we've got a question from Eva. She says, can you explain the difference in habitat features and requirements between a natal den and a burrow?
That is $1 million question. Steve Symes, he did a winter ecology with some of the badgers up in the central part of BC, and he looked at burrows versus maternal dens and natal dens. And generally, if it's a really big burrow with a lot of soil displaced, and it's hard to measure it all, but if there's this one random large burrow with a big mound of soil, that's probably more important burrow than out in the middle of a hayfield that's full of Columbia ground squirrels and you just got a bunch of holes going straight down into the field. That would be more considered the foraging burrow. So a lot of these little roadside burrows that they come back to over and over again, they'll just use them as little campsite burrows along their travels. But in 1 year, all of a sudden, it might be more cleaned out than usual, and they might have kits in there. And then once they have their kits in May and June, they start moving around the kits following them. And usually the kits, they go into a burrow for a week or two, and the kits start digging holes everywhere as they get bigger. And so if you find a complex also of like 5-7 burrows all interconnected, that's also maybe a good sign that a maternal family unit was using that area for that time. That's my best guess. It's not super scientific.
Okay. Lots of experience gone into that though. Okay, we have another question from Anonymous. What's the best place for community scientists to upload any badger sightings that we see? For example, is iNaturalist useful?
I think, yeah, anywhere that you can report it. There was, and I think it's still active, www.badgers.bc.ca. I think there's a reporting tool there, and they do track that, and they do provide those data to researchers looking at, exploring where there might be a lack of information, or, is there badgers there? Are they doing well? I don't think any studies have been recently done on inventory for badgers in BC since probably 2008-9. So there might be more to come there from the badger recovery team.
Okay, great. Okay, this next one is a conversation from Stephen, and there's some great feedback from those of you in attendance from Blair and Lorna already, but let's see what you have to say about it. It says, are there any other species that have been regularly observed using the small underpasses? So for example, toads. Blair Smith says, yeah, up near Summit Lake Nakusp, they're used by Western toads, and Lorna is noting that she's seeing toadlets and adults use the small pipes as well. Do you have any additional thoughts there?
In the central interior, the Columbia ground squirrels, they used them a lot. And I think that's why we saw long-tailed weasels, short-tailed weasels, even coyotes wedging their way through those things. And it probably didn't hurt that badgers were exploring those culverts looking for rodents. So yeah, Columbia ground squirrels are huge for using them.
Okay, great, thanks. So just a note, if there's folks putting some questions in the chat, we're gonna ask you to redirect that question to the Q&A function, just in case you didn't get that note back from us. And I'm gonna hone in on conversation with Tracy. I know you talked about this a little bit already, but we did do a whole series on this sort of stuff last season, of which Tracy was a part of. So let's see if you have any other little juicy bits that you could share with us. And she says, what's the preferred crossing structure for badgers? Will they use larger underpasses or overpasses? I think you had said you'd prefer the small one, or they prefer small ones, but you might have some more information there.
Yeah, no, from what I monitored, I think there was over 40 structures. There were those large 2-meter like livestock underpasses. And while they used them, I think they were more based on the remote camera photos. They're more wary. They're looking around more. They're walking slowly through. Whereas that 50-centimeter, 60-centimeter culvert, they just loved them. They were just cruising through them all the time. It's nice to do things where you put some earth. A lot of time the old washouts would bring sand and gravel into the floor of the culvert. I think that really increased their use by all sorts of animals. They're not stepping on the cold corrugated steel. They're quite wary because of, people and traps and stuff like that. So, yeah, the most frequent use was by far the 50-centimeter, 60-centimeter culverts.
Great, thanks. Okay, question from Amanda. It sounds like the loss of grassland habitat is the main driving issue for badger declines. Is there work occurring on conservation lands and other critical habitat, example working ranches, to address forest encroachment? It seems like habitat will continue to constrict over time, and if not, it seems like it'll continue to constrict over time if not, and there will be more highway mortality issues as well. And Sarah adds on, my question is somewhat related to this, and she's wondering if with wildfires today, despite their intensity, if they provide opportunity for grassland regeneration.
Hillary, you want to go in the big picture?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, some of the work we talk about is the open forest and grassland restoration is definitely for badgers among other species, and the work occurring at the trench scale has also benefits multiple species. So yeah, the work is occurring, and there are also opportunities for private landowners to apply for funding to do work on their own lands as well. In terms of fire recreating habitat, the fires we historically had in an open habitat like the one we're looking at the screen right now, they would have been low intensity fires, and taken out some of the small trees, restored the undergrowth. some of these hot fires we're having, what they're called catastrophic for a reason. And it's really hard for the systems to recover from a fire like that. And they don't do it like they would with a low intensity fire. In terms of badgers, Richard, I assume they're not as picky as, say, bunchgrasses are, but still the remaining structure wouldn't be quite the same as it would be if it'd been a low intensity fire.
Yeah, and I would add that if you look at the range of grasslands in BC, they're long linear lines up and down our valleys, and you look at the badger range map and it's broader and wider. And from Williams Lake, open Douglas fir, like in British Columbia, our grasslands, a lot of them are not like the open savanna, Alberta prairies or Saskatchewan. We sometimes call it treed grasslands. It's like it's driven by fire, big open stands of Douglas fir, ponderosa, western larch, that have a healthy bunchgrass community in the understory. And so, it doesn't necessarily need to be like a true open grassland to support badgers. So there's a lot of that land in those valleys that could support badgers that a lot of people don't define as a grassland in their mind, but they're open forest grasslands. And so by thinning out the encroachment and restoring fire, it'll benefit all the species that evolved under that system, including badgers.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got, I think, a few more minutes. I'll just do a couple more questions. There's a question here from Nick. For grassland restoration and management, does the NCCBC work with grazing lessees to manage the type of grazing done and on their properties? So for example, targeted grazing, rotational grazing, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, generally, yes. All our leaseholders, we work with them to ensure the grazing is compatible with conservation. But Richard, maybe you want to speak to some of the specifics, the ranchers you're working with in the trench.
Yeah, so often the conservation property is fenced off. It's with wildlife friendly fencing so that young fawns and elk can get under the fence, over the fence, but still hold cattle in. And we will often divide the property into different zones and have rotational grazing. We started in a small area north of Invermere on a previous, intensive hayfield, and we started working with a local producer there to do small, high-intensity grazing in small pastures. Often we have whole pastures or properties rested for a year or two, or just generally reduce some stocking densities and and have them on the range for shorter periods of time if the rancher can have other opportunities like on the adjacent public grazing tenures.
Great, thanks. Hillary, I've got a question here for you. Kate asks, what guidance or best management practices would you recommend for sustainable range use of grasslands? You mentioned some newly acquired land in the Nicola as being leased for cattle.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who we're working with, and some of the practices Richard just mentioned, fencing, offsite watering, keeping cattle moving around. The ranch in the Nicola, when NCC acquired it, one of the reasons we acquired it is the grasslands were in amazing shape to begin with. So the people who've been managing the property had done quite an impressive job of rotating their livestock quite frequently. And so in that case, we were able to work with the previous owner to keep that type of rotation in place. And we worked with some consultants who may even be on the call today, one of them, to do range health assessment as a baseline. And we just continue to monitor that range health. And if we see a problem, then we can work with the leaseholder to address that issue. And it's usually, like I said, something to do with fencing or off-site watering, but it really depends on where we are and who we're working with.
Okay, great. One more question and then we'll wrap up. So we've got one more question here that says from Anonymous. We have to figure out who this is. How can we reduce conflict with humans? For example, badgers who like to eat chickens and become a nuisance. And adding on to that, Kobe forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Kobe would also like to ask if there are any recommendations to help reduce concern for farmers who have badgers present on their grazing land. So concerns being livestock injuries from the burrows, for example.
I can go on the burrow part. Previously, researchers, I believe it was Rich Weir and Helen Davis, did a big inventory survey assessment in Western Canada, I believe in Western US, to veterinarians about injuries from burrows to livestock. And it was actually not as high as they had expected. It was a lot lower. I don't have the numbers in front of me. But often what I've noted when because a lot of ranchers and farmers, they recognize that the badger is doing them a favor in a way by reducing other burrowing mammals like the ground squirrels. They often just take the buckets of their tractors and smooth out the burrows on their intensively farmed hay fields. And that way they don't hurt their machinery. And then that way, if the ground squirrel comes back, the badger comes back, they just kind of repeat the cycle. And a lot of ranchers and farmers recognize and tolerate some of that soil disturbance. And quite often when you spread it out, the hay just grows right back up through the thin soil that they spread out. As far as like killing chickens and stuff, I think there's a lot of work with the Conservation Officer Service on trying to have the badger move on its own. There's various things you can try, wetting, making it a muddy area or something like that, but not flooding them out. And but yeah, translocating badgers or moving badgers is sort of a last resort. Often, yeah, I guess they might get into trouble. They might kill some chickens, but usually they don't camp out there for a long period. They do move on. They usually, when they do get into trouble, or they seem like they're setting up shop under somebody's house, they do move on in a few days. And then you just fill the burrows back in, put some rocks in there, make it less desirable for them to come back. And often that's the main ticket. Often they don't come back. Yeah, it's a tough one when they start getting into trouble. But I find that a lot of ranchers, even in the States, I was working down there. There was a rancher, he had 100 horses, and he said he had one horse ever hurt a horse leg in his time there, 30 years or something. And he had badgers all running up and down his driveway when I drove in. And yeah, he was totally tolerant of badgers because one, he didn't have time to deal with them. And two, he knew that they were reducing all the other rodents on the property. So.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to run through some gratitudes and share a little bit more information, and then we'll close the webinar to ensure that everybody can get on with the business they have this afternoon. Thanks everyone for attending, and I'm just going to share my screen here. Sorry, take a moment. There we go. Thanks also to Richard and Hillary for your time. Thanks also for your work and for sharing it with us. There were a number of questions we didn't get to, so my apologies to everyone for not being able to get to your question. Richard and Hillary have said that they are happy to answer questions. And so if you still have a burning question and want to get in touch with them, feel free to connect with them. If you need help being connected with them, feel free to email me and I'll help make that happen. So in addition to thanking our speakers, of course, we thank our funders, without which this series and a lot of this work wouldn't be possible. We would like to welcome you to attend the next webinar in the series, whereby we welcome Ian Adams, who's going to present a talk on present a talk on key biodiversity areas in the Kootenay, Columbia, sites of unique biodiversity. So some interesting work happening there. And that's not next week, but the week after. And the other little plug I wanted to make is that for those of you who are engaged in the world of grassland ecosystems, of which I know many of you are, if you haven't already heard, there's a symposia taking place in Kimberley in the first week of May on the topic of grassland health and grasslands and rangelands stewardship. So you can find that information on the CMI homepage. Registration has just softly opened, and the call for proposals, of which I think many of you on the call are likely submitting to, closes next week. So just a reminder on that. Is that it? I think that's all. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time and we'll reconnect soon.
Thanks.
Bye.